Hi everyone, my name is Stevan Gavrilovic and I'm a postdoctoral scholar and software developer at the SimCenter. It's at UC Berkeley. And today I'm excited to talk about the hurricane wind field simulation capabilities that are introduced in version 1.1 of the Regional Resilience Determination tool, or the R2D tool, for which I'm a developer on. So the goal of this application is to simulate a hurricane wind field, the peak wind speeds, on a grid of points, which can later be used in damage and loss calculations. So the peak wind speeds are calculated using a linear analytical model for the boundary layer wind developed by Snakey and Wu in 2017. So in this app, the user needs to specify three things. One is a hurricane track, which is a list of geographic points, i.e. in the latitude and longitude, which define the location of the hurricane center at specific points in time. After that, they need to define the location and properties of when the hurricane makes landfall. And this is when the hurricane leaves a body of water and makes contact with land. And the third thing the user needs to define is a grid. So a grid at which the wind field can be calculated. In the R2D tool, there are two ways to input a hurricane, and I'll be going over both. So the first is manually defining the hurricane. That is, the user needs to specify the track and the landfall location and properties. And the second is selecting a hurricane, or a historical storm, I should say, from a database. And here the IBTRACS, or International Best Track Archive for Climate Stewardship by NOAA, is bundled with R2D. And it lists the most major storms that have occurred globally over the last 3 years. So going forward, I will go over both manual input and historical storm selection. And I'll provide an example of each one and run a hurricane simulation that can be used in downstream analyses here in the user-specified Windfield app. So I'll first go over how to define a hurricane manually. So the first step is going here under hurricane definition and to specify a hurricane track. And I'm going to import the hurricane track CSV file. I'm going to do that right now. And essentially what's in this file is a list of latitude and longitude coordinates. And that file looks like this. So there's no header, it's just a paired list. So each row is a set of latitude and longitude values. And these must be in temporal order. So the first value will be when the hurricane started. And the last value will be the final point of the hurricane. And when you import this file, you'll see the track show up in the GIS window below here. And each one of these dots or circles is a point on the track. And the arrow shows the direction of the hurricane. If I click on a point, it will show the different information available at that point. So latitude, longitude, and the fact that this is a user-specified hurricane track is highlighted as well. So in this example, I'll be running a grid here in Atlantic City. So I'm going to go ahead and load some assets. Now my assets are loaded, and you could find this set of assets here in example 7 up here in the R2D examples menu bar. So this is the Atlantic City testbed. I'm going to go back to the hurricane hazards pane. Now, optionally, users have the ability to import a terrain roughness polygon. So this will specify the roughness in the region of interest. And if you do not specify one, a default value will be used. But in this case, I happen to have one. So terrain.geojson, and here we got the polygon appearing. The next step is to specify our landfall location and parameters. R2D has the option to define the landfall on the GIS map. And up in the right corner, you will see the input boxes for the latitude, the longitude, and everything, all the other properties at landfall. To define the landfall, click on the Define Landfall on Map button, and this blue dot will appear. Now the user should drag this blue dot to the location where they expect landfall to be. So I will just put it here. and then I will click on the Select Landfall button, and a blue diamond will appear at that location, and the latitude and longitude values will be filled in up here. Now we do have some example inputs up for these different parameters like landing angle, speed, and so on, but it is up to the user to enter their own parameters for landfall. Finally, the last and third step is defining the wind field grid. So up here in the left side, I will click on the Define Grid on Map button, which will cause this grid to appear in the GIS window. Clicking on the red dot in the center will allow me to move the grid to where I want it. And clicking on any one of the blue corners will allow me to resize the grid. I'm going to increase the discretization of the grid. And I will zoom in and out using the scroll wheel on my mouse to adjust the grid so it has good coverage of my assets. Maybe something like this. When I'm done and I'm happy with the grid, I will click on the Select Grid button right up here again on the left, and it will finalize the grid, and it will appear as these little cross symbols. I could click on any point to get the latitude and longitude at that location, the station number, and you'll notice that there is no peak wind speeds yet for that point. If I'm not happy with the grid, I could select the clear grid, and it will allow me to redo that process again. And the same goes for landfall as well. If I don't like where the landfall is, I could clear the landfall and define it again. Now that I have my hurricane track specified, my grid specified, a landfall location and parameters filled in, I could run the hurricane simulation. And to do that, I will click on the Run button over here on the right. Now notice the program output will appear at the bottom, along with this progress bar down here that will go back and forth while the script is running in the background. And this may take a while depending on the length of your hurricane track. Now that the simulation is complete, you'll see that the progress bar that was at the bottom here is now gone, and you'll see the status message, done loading results. So I'm going to close the output there. And if I zoom in, I could click on one of these points, and now you'll see the peak wind speeds at this location. So in this case, there are 3 peak wind speeds provided, because up here in the number per site box, I have 3 as a value. If I change this number, then you'll have different numbers of peak wind speeds generated at each point. Now you can view these results by going into the output folder. In my case, that would be under My Documents, R2D, Local Work There, Hazard Simulation, and Hurricanes. And here you'll see the input folder, which was generated by R2D to be sent back into the backend, and also the output folder containing the result. So each one of these is a grid point. If I open it up, you'll see the peak wind speeds, 3 of them at each file. And if I go down to the bottom, you'll see the eventgrid.csv file. So this is the file that has the entire grid in it. Now this event grid file is important because I can now save everything in this output folder, go back here into user specified wind field, and where it says event file, I will point it to that event grid file, and it will load the results of that simulation without having to repeat it for analyses downstream. Now I'm going to clear everything and explain how we could do the same thing, but with a historical storm. So now that everything is cleared, I could go back into the hazards pane and show you how you could import a historical track. So first you'll go up here into the hurricane definition combo box, and you'll select hurricane track from database option. And the next thing we do is we'll click on the load hurricane database button, to load the database, and it might take a few seconds. So now you see here the tracks of every hurricane, or every major storm I should say, that occurred globally in the last 3 years or so. And again, this is from the IAB Tracks database. But of course the user can go into this database file, which happens to be a CSV file, and add new storms, make their own database file. So this is how that looks. And if you follow the same file name and the same headings, you can put your own information here and create essentially your own database of storms that you'd like to use. Once all the storm tracks are loaded, you can zoom in on a particular track and select it directly on the GIS map. And when you do click on a track, it will be highlighted and a pop-up will appear showing the showing the information for that track. The season, the storm ID, the name. Here I'll select Hurricane Zeta in 2020. And I'll do that by going up here and clicking on the Select Hurricane button, which will finalize the selection. You'll notice automatically that the hurricane landfall appears. In some cases, the storm could cross land more than once along its track, and the first landfall location will be selected. What the user can do is they can clear that landfall by clicking on the Clear Landfall button, and then define landfall again where they think it should occur. So I'll use something very close to the original point, and I will select that landfall. Now note, when you do change landfall, these parameter values are not programmatically imported as they are when it automatically finds landfall. So what happens when R2D finds that the distance to land is 0, it'll select that point as landfall, and all the parameters at that point will be used to fill in these values up here. So now that the hurricane track and landfall are selected, I want to highlight another feature of R2D, and that's the ability to truncate a hurricane track. So for hurricane tracks that are very long, like this one, we might be interested in an area up here, or we might be interested in this area down here. Now to reduce the computational effort, I'm going to truncate this track just so it considers this location down here. And I'm going to do that by clicking on the Select Area on Map button up here, right beside Truncate Hurricane Track. And this will allow me to create a polygon. So by clicking on the screen, I create the corner points of my selection polygon. And every point that falls within this polygon will be kept, and everything else will be discarded. If I make a mistake, I could go up here and press Clear, and it will allow me to select another polygon that I'm satisfied with. And once I'm happy with my selection, I click on the Apply button, and the truncated hurricane track remains. The last step now that I have my track, my landfall, I got to define a grid. I'm going to zoom in here to Merida. Before I had buildings, but you don't really need any buildings to run a hurricane simulation. I just had them there to help me with the grid selection, but here I'll define a grid over the entire city. Look something like this. Perhaps I'll increase my divisions. And I will click on Select Grid. So now that I have everything, I'll do the number per site at 5 this time. And again, I'll click on the Run Hurricane Simulation button. And now that the results are done and everything is loaded, I could click on any point and I will see the peak wind speeds appear. And thank you very much for watching this video. If you have any feature requests or suggestions, please go to the R2D forum at the SimCenter, hosted by the SimCenter, and make a post with any requests, issues you may have. And thank you very much.